Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. Today I want to respond to an email that I've received from a member of the congregation here at All Saints, which I'm going to read a couple of extracts for you, appropriately anonymized and so on. And it has to do with how we respond, or how we should or could respond as Christians to the tragic events arising from the flooding in Texas in the last week or so. As I'm recording this, it's Thursday, the 10th, and this will be going out in the following week. So by the time you hear it, it'll be over a week ago. But you will know that in excess of 100 people are known to have lost their lives, even at this point, and others unaccounted for. People have lost property. People have lost loved ones. People have, in the future, in days and months and years to come, communities will remain significantly affected. People's businesses will be impacted, even if they've survived in some areas. They certainly haven't survived in some areas. It's just one terrible tragedy. And this member of the congregation wrote me an email saying, I'd love to ask for a podcast or some other input from you, helping us to know how to grieve appropriately in faith in the light of the events of this past weekend in Texas. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but this is the gist of it. I've been grieving heavily for the families who've died or lost children. My husband and I have talked about it at length, and he's cautioned me not to enter into sinful empathy. That last phrase is a direct quote. I'm struggling with this concept and want to know what it looks like to faithfully mourn with those who mourn and process these events as a Christian. She continues, I know I'm not alone. Spoken with other mothers and friends in our congregation. And so, well, honestly, that's what this podcast is for. It's to respond to or provide teaching for folks in the congregation here at All Saints. So I'm happy to do so. And it may surprise you as you look at the, I don't know how long this podcast is going to go on for, as you look at the timestamp. How could it take so long to talk about something where you think the answer is fairly straightforward? And in a sense, I think the answer is fairly straightforward. But the reason for spending some time on it in the next few minutes is that this question, though in a sense the basics are fairly straightforward, and I want to give you some guidance up front in a moment about that, how we should respond to this kind of situation. The question actually exposes a whole cluster of other questions or problems with how we make decisions in general, how we respond to different situations we find ourselves in, and how we act wisely, particularly in response to events that impact us emotionally. So what I want to do, I'll start, as I said, with some initial thoughts, just hopefully to encourage you, and just pastoral exhortation. And then I'm going to take what will probably seem like quite a complex, because it is quite complex, detour into trying to analyze what's going on behind the scenes, so to speak, in our thinking, and give you some kind of theological and ethical analysis of how we ought to process questions like this and what can go wrong if we make mistakes. And we could make some quite bad mistakes in different aspects of our lives if we go about this in the wrong way. And then I'll come back at the end to consider some other kinds of responses we might make to this kind of situation. And hopefully by then you'll see why some of those are great things to do and others are not so good. In a sense, what I'm going to be doing is trying to surface our intuitions, our ethical intuitions, and then trying to ask, okay, in biblical terms, are these intuitive responses good or bad? And if they're good or bad, why are they good or bad? It's not always enough just to understand what the right answer is. I want to try and give you enough detail that you can see why certain responses are helpful and positive and deeply Christian, and others, though well-intentioned, might be unhelpful. So let's just start with the basics. And it is hard to find words to describe the tragedy. Imagine you send your beautiful, wonderful kids off to summer camp, and that's the last you see of them because the wonderful holiday park by the side of the river turned into a raging torrent and they were just swept away. It is very hard to imagine what that feels like. I suspect that you've been praying for the families, for those who've lost property, whose businesses have been impacted, for those who are still unaccounted for the rescue workers and others, volunteers and so on, who've been helping to try and find any survivors. And there's going to be a bunch of clear up for months or years to come. And praying for those people is it's just an intuitive Christian response. And I've been praying for them. I'm sure you have. We've prayed for them here as a church. You may find that you struggle to know what to pray. And in those circumstances, of course, the scriptures provide us not just words from God to us, but words for us to speak back to God in prayer. The Psalms of Lament in particular are very helpful. And they all presuppose different circumstances. And there's never a 100% match between Psalms of Lament and our particular circumstance of lament, or Psalms of Praise and our particular circumstances of praise. But don't be put off by that. You may find that, for example, Psalm 6 is a wonderful psalm to pray in this kind of circumstance. Verse 8 makes it look like it's a different kind of scenario. And of course, it's occasioned by a different scenario. But you can pray those psalms if you don't know what to pray. I think perhaps Psalm 90 is among the most helpful. This is the prayer of Moses. And it's, I'll leave you to pray it. If you want to hit pause on this podcast and prayerfully read through that psalm, holding in mind the victims and families of victims and those affected by these floods, then that'd be a great thing to do. And by the way, that is how to pray the Psalms. There's no, I think sometimes we talk about, pray through the Psalms, and then people sit down and they're not quite sure what to do at that point. How long do I have to take to do it? Do I just read the Psalm? Do I have to kind of stop at every verse and paraphrase the sentiments and personalize them directly? Or can I just have somebody in mind and pray and say, Lord, please hear this prayer for these people? The answer is yes, of course, all of the above. You could pray for half an hour about one or two verses in here, or you could simply hold in mind the people concerned and ask the Lord to hear this prayer which he's given to us through Moses, his servant, and ask, Lord, please hear this prayer. Pardon me, that's a notification on my phone. Please hear this prayer as my soul's cry to you for these people who are so painfully affected by these difficult and painful circumstances. So that's perfectly fine and good and wonderful thing to do. Actually, I think, just to go a bit deeper, circumstances like this inevitably incline us to reflect on other themes, other biblical themes, and verses 12 and 13, for example. So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. That's just verse 12. Isn't it the case that we are prompted by painful circumstances such as this to think, goodness, how many days do I have? I don't know. In a sense, I need to live now as though I'm going to live quite a long time into the future, because I need to work for the future and plan for the future. We do that all the time with our work and our study and our education and raising our children and tidying our homes. You know, if you thought you were going to live for 20 minutes, you probably wouldn't spend that 15 of those 20 doing the dishes. But we all do things that look to the long-term future, and yet at the same time, we know that every breath could be our last, and tragedies such as this remind us of the ephemeral frailty of human life. And it's interesting that the way that thought is developed, it's very striking how that thought is developed in the psalm. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. So however many days they are. It doesn't try and do a sort of moral consequentialist calculus about whether you should live this day as though it's your last, or those kind of slightly trite aphorisms. What it does say is, we need a heart of wisdom. Teach us to reflect on our times so that we get a heart of wisdom, whatever that means. And maybe actually that's what I'm going to try and do with you in the next few minutes. And then it's a cry to God for pity and for him to satisfy us with his steadfast love. May we, for all the days that we do have, be satisfied with his kindness to us. So, look, there are some initial thoughts, and in a sense, if this has really upset you, then I kind of want to stop there. Maybe you kind of put a bookmark in this podcast, come back to it in a few days or weeks' time. But what I do want to do is to pick up what the very wise husband of this very thoughtful lady said to her. I mean, and actually, just as an aside, what a wonderful picture of a husband and wife. I mean, none of us walk on water, and none of us are perfect, but I do want to commend husbands who will talk at length with their wives about things that their wives are clearly emotionally wrestling with, and who will not be afraid to say, whoa, hold on a second, I think, I know you're upset, I know you're sad, I know you're grieving, but cautioned me not to enter into sinful empathy. That's actually a very wise thought, and let's just dig into that for a second, because what does it mean? I mean, what could it possibly mean to say, as a husband, let's say your wife is clearly upset by these events that happened a couple of 100 miles away, and the husband says, okay, I understand, but let's be careful not to enter into sinful empathy. What does that even mean? Okay, so what is empathy precisely? Now, definitions vary, but in recent years, you may know, you may not know, that philosophers have, particularly a non-Christian philosopher by the name of Paul Bloom, has done some significant amount of work identifying the character of empathy and contrasting it with other related emotional responses, particularly compassion. Paul Bloom wrote a book, I think in 2018, called Against Empathy, which was there's a title designed to catch people's attention. Empathy is one of those things where it superficially people treat it as though it's an unalloyed good. Like, what could possibly be wrong with empathy? How could you have too much of that? Well, it turns out that on certain definitions of empathy, it is possible to have at least misplaced empathy. The subtitle, I think, is The Case for Rational Compassion. And so let me give you my own take on how, as Christians, we should think about this. Now, remembering, of course, Paul Bloom is not a Christian, but like many very, very intelligent and articulate unbelievers, he might not always have the right answers, but the questions he asks and the ways he goes about seeking to wrestle with them can often be very helpful for us, because they can help sharpen our thinking. So let's try and allow Paul Bloom to sharpen our thinking. Incidentally, just another footnote, a distant friend of mine and someone who's known to some of us, Joe Rigney, has picked up some of these themes in a recent book of his, which I've not read, at least not in detail. I've skimmed it. And it may be that I think that book is directed more towards the misuse of empathy in relation to leadership issues in churches. And obviously there's another question there. But I don't think he's thinking quite about the sort of topic we're considering today. But anyway, empathy and compassion. Let's not get fixated on the words. Let's just think about two distinct concepts. And in this context, then, let's define empathy as feeling the emotions that somebody else is feeling. So if you're grieving, I will grieve with you. If you're mourning, I will mourn with you. If you're rejoicing, I'll rejoice with you. If you're excited, I'll be excited with you. empathy, and this is etymologically where the word comes from, to feel in or with somebody, to feel what they're feeling, means simply mirroring their emotional response. And clearly, that is a biblical idea. Think of Romans 12. Weep with those who weep. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. It's like, literally, that's telling you to be empathic in certain circumstances. But we might distinguish that from compassion. And again, I not want to be fixated on the terms. If you want to come up with two different labels to describe these concepts, that's okay. I'm not worried about that at all. But what I do want to do is to distinguish feeling what somebody else feels, literally mirroring their emotional life, from responding emotionally to them in some way that is not necessarily identical to their response, but which is driven by love and is ready to act in the way that's best for them. Let me give you an example. You weep with those who weep, empathy. You rejoice with those who rejoice. Somebody's just got their first job after college. Like, yeah, that's fantastic. Somebody's just got, they've just given birth to a child and the child is safe and they're rejoicing. You rejoice with them. You just feel what they're feeling, empathy. Suppose somebody's fearful. They're about to start that job, or they're about to embark on the long road of raising that child. And they're anxious and uncertain and fearful. How much help is it for you to feel anxious and fearful and uncertain? No help at all. Well, empathy would do that. Empathy unconstrained by norms that determine that some other emotional response is appropriate will actually do harm in those circumstances. Can you see the situation? Can you see the problem we're dealing with? So take those examples. Young mum, we've got a couple of those, haven't we, at All Saints? Giving birth to a first child, so excited, frankly overwhelmed. So you go around and you're excited, but what about the overwhelm? No, you don't want to do that. You want to be almost the opposite of that. You, driven by compassion, that is a love for and a being moved emotionally by their plight. You want to respond emotionally in a different way. You want them to see in you calm and courage and wise counsel and a sense of, no, it's going to be fine. It's okay. No, don't do that. Try this. And just mirroring somebody's emotions in those circumstances is clearly not a good idea. So the mere fact that somebody feels a certain thing does not mean that empathy is the appropriate response. Empathy, and that is in the sense of feeling what they feel, needs to be governed by other criteria. Some other normative or situational criteria. We'll come to those terms in a few minutes' time. To put all that another way, we don't just want to be led by our feelings, especially if our feelings simply mirror what somebody else's feelings are, because feelings are not morally normative. Feelings are really important, which is why it's a good idea, but it's very important not to be led by them. They're very important because they'll determine and shape much of our lives, but they are very, very bad guides to ethics. They're very, very bad guides to wise decision making. So precisely because our feelings matter, we want to act in ways that are scripturally wise and bring good outcomes, so that our feelings will follow in our wake and we will be stable, joyful, at peace, non-anxious, non-fearful, trusting, joyful people. The way to get there is not to be led by your fears and your anxieties. Now, I want to throw another example into the mix here of a secular philosopher who's well known for generating a whole bunch of thought experiments, one of which I want to share with you, that highlights very potently some of the ways in which a purely emotional response can be unhelpful and unwise. Now, like I said, just as with Paul Bloom, so also with this guy, it's Peter Singer, probably one of the most famous secular ethicists alive today. Just as with Paul Bloom, so also with Peter Singer, what we're not going to be saying is, oh, we read these guys and we just do what they say. I'm absolutely not going to be saying that with Peter Singer, I promise you. But always, like very, very smart unbelievers sometimes ask really good questions, and they might not give the right answers, but they might present us with a challenge that the answering of which, from a biblical standpoint, which is what I want to try and give you, leads us to a place of greater wisdom, greater understanding, and greater moral clarity, and even greater Christian faithfulness. It's interesting that the questions that unbelievers ask sometimes prompt believers to shape up, frankly, and get a better grip on how they ought to be living. So Peter Singer devised a very famous ethical thought experiment called the shallow pond. And some of you may have heard of this. If you've studied ethics with me at the Reformed Evangelical Seminary, you've heard of it. It's one of the examples that we spent a few minutes on, just trying to understand. The shallow pond scenario goes like this. Just want you to imagine for a second that you're walking through the park and you walk past a shallow pond in which you see a young child struggling to stay afloat. The pond is a few feet deep, but the child is still struggling and crying out for help. Please help me, rescue me. And you're about to go over and help this kid wade through the muddy reeds at the side and wade out into the water. But then you realize that you've just bought a new pair of shoes. And these shoes, they're like $100 shoes, $150 shoes or something, quite fancy shoes. And if you wade out into the middle of the pond, you'll probably ruin the shoes. It's like maybe $150. Your socks and trousers as well will certainly need cleaning, and the shoes will be ruined. It'll take you quite a lot of time, a certain amount of inconvenience. So you're looking at some costs, a couple of $100, a couple of hours of your time to save this child. Now, what would you do? And Peter Singer points out, I think rightly, that only a complete psychopath would not go out into the pond and do whatever they could to save this child. The child is 20 yards away over there. Please help me. I'm drowning. Only an amoral beast of a person would think that their shoes are more valuable than this child's life. The cost in terms of time and in terms of just pure financial cost would not even figure in our minds. And in fact, if at that point we could push a button and save the child's life, and it cost us $1,000 or $10,000 or $50,000, who among us would not push the button? We'll find a way of sorting out the money later. This child's life is literally there. Singer doesn't add the push the button point. That's my addition to it, but it serves to strengthen the argument, I think. We value human life, in the case of this small child drowning in the pond, so much that we would sacrifice time and money to save this child. Of course, what Peter Singer goes on to point out is that, and again, to paraphrase, in the time that you've been listening to this podcast, several dozen children have died in sub-Saharan Africa from malaria because they didn't have a mosquito net impregnated with insecticide that would cost about $3.50 or something, which would have saved their lives. And none of us are as emotionally affected by the empirical reality of that as we are emotionally affected by the imagined reality of this one child whose life we could save at the cost of hundreds or thousands of dollars. And just think about this for a second. We would respond to a child who's right there at the cost of thousands. We routinely do not respond, and more than that, we're completely emotionally unaffected by the plight of countless thousands of children who die of preventable diseases all the time, whose lives could be saved for a fraction of the cost of saving this child. And Peter Singer points out the inconsistency, as he sees it, of that scenario. And so I want to pause for a second and just ask you to mull on that for a second. Do you feel the problem that he's calling attention to? Now, you might think you have some pushback or some solutions. Just press pause on that for a second. But you can feel the weight of the difficulty. Minimally, what it highlights is that we are in danger of responding emotionally to things that have a significant moral gravity. A child struggling in a pond a few yards away, while at the same time not responding emotionally to things that, in at least in abstract terms, in raw numerical terms, have a much higher moral gravity. I mean, the death of a child or the death of 1,000 children. 600 or 700,000 children a year die of malaria alone in sub-Saharan Africa. Those deaths are preventable. We've got treatments and we've got mosquito nets. Hundreds of thousands of children do not need to die. And when you think about it, there are lots of situations like this where our emotional responses are much more significant when one person whose plight we can sort of see and identify with is at stake, rather than when lots of people whose plight we can't see and identify with is at stake. And the disparity is a bit alarming. In fact, researchers have done experiments. Experimental psychologists have done work on this to try and figure out what happens to people's emotional responses when they're presented with different scenarios. And it is precisely the opposite of what you would hope would happen. If you tell a story about a single individual who, let's say, has a life-threatening disease that can easily be cured, and you ask the question, how much would you be willing to pay to save the life of this person? You get a certain number averaged over a number of participants. If you frame scenarios differently, so that it's not just this one little girl, say, but it's this little girl and her two brothers and her parents, the average number of dollars that people will be willing to spend to save the lives of those people decreases. And if you then increase it further and you start talking about not narrated lives of individual people, but you just talk about raw data, statistics, 10,000 people a year, the number drops further still. And what it suggests is that as human, there's a bug in our psychology, or at least a potential bug, a feature that in some circumstances is a bug, where we respond to individual, personal, salient narratives in a way that is disproportionately strong compared to how we respond to actual data that is not so personal and narrated. Now, I want to come back to this in a few minutes. I don't think it's 100% a bug, as Peter Singer does, for reasons I'll explain. But it's nonetheless troubling, isn't it? And you can all remember the story of a really heartrending story of one little girl trapped down a well in a country a long, long way away, captures the news media for days on end, whereas the plight of tens of thousands of unfilmed and nameless little boys and girls is ignored all the time. There's something going on in our minds which seems to be problematic at the very least. Now, what's Peter Singer's take on this? And like I said, I'm not arguing that Peter Singer's take is correct. What I'm saying is he's raising a question that we've got to answer, and we'll get to answering it in a few minutes. Peter Singer embraces a school of ethical thought which is called consequentialism. Broadly speaking, there are three schools of secular ethical thought. We'll come to these in a few minutes: deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. I'll explain what these are in a second. But consequentialism basically evaluates the rightness or wrongness of an action from the consequences that are seen to flow from it. There are nuances to this. There are different schools of thought within consequentialism. But basically what consequentialists say, what's the outcomes? What's going to be the result of this? Another famous consequentialist is Sam Harris. So what Peter Singer says is, look, given that we would all respond in this way to the plight of one child who's close to us when it's expensive to help them, we ought to respond to try to save the lives of all those children whose names we don't know, who are dying of preventable diseases. Because for the same amount of money, $2,000 or whatever it is to save the life of this child, we might be able to save 100 or 200 or 300 children who need a mosquito net. And so what consequentialism does in the limit, as an ethical school of thought, it generates charitable endeavors where what you're trying to do basically is maximize the bang for your buck. And you actually think, that's not a bad idea. I mean, there's some wisdom in it, isn't there? Again, we'll see some wrinkles in a second, but the effective altruism movement, which you may have heard of, has grown up in the last few years. The effective altruism movement was the movement that was associated with the name of Sam Bankman-Fried, the crypto guy. That's right, it's him. And that's a clue about what they're missing, by the way. But one of the things that the effective altruism movement did was to say, okay, well, if we, this is again a paraphrase, but imagine a donor has $1 million to donate. They're well-intentioned person, they're charitably minded, they're wealthy, they've got $1 million to donate. Where should they put it? And the effective altruism movement generated a whole bunch of tools for basically trying to deploy capital, charitable capital, where it would do, quote unquote, the most good. Like, where would it save the most lives? If $1 million could save 100,000 lives with mosquito nets, or it could save 50,000 lives with a certain vaccine, well, let's deploy it to the mosquito nets at least first. Let's take the low-hanging fruit and get the biggest bang for our buck. So that's consequentialism. Put more broadly and abstractly, what a consequentialist would say, if you're a really, really hardcore consequentialist, really kind of rough-edged, sharp consequentialist, you'll say you should deploy your time and charitable time and charitable capital where the outcomes will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. And it's morally appropriate to do that. And it's a moral mistake, a consequentialist would say. It's a misdeployment of time and capital to deploy it where you're not maximizing at least your attempted greatest good for the greatest number. You see how this would work. Now, you can see some of the benefits of that. And on one hand, for those of us who are sort of mathematically minded and pragmatically minded, you think, actually, that's quite sensible. Do you want your charitable funding to go where it doesn't make a difference or where it does, right? I want it to go where it does make a difference. And we certainly embrace these kind of principles as a church with the ministries that we support. In part, one of the things we're doing is thinking, well, which of the potential missionaries we support have a reputation for working really hard and are being really fruitful in their ministry, so that when we support them, we know we're supporting somebody who's not just going to be sitting around doing nothing all day. And I can tell you that the missionaries that we support, I've been very impressed by the diligence that they show in their service. But it can't be the only consideration. How should we approach an evaluation of this kind of consequentialist ethic? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. One comes from this email that the lady sent me. Let me pick it up again. I'm struggling with this concept and want to know what it looks like to faithfully mourn with those who mourn and process these events as a Christian. Jesus wept with Mary and Martha at the death of their brother, Lazarus. What does this mean for us? I think that is a very insightful point. Just think of John 11. Let's turn to it now. In John chapter 11, you know that there's this extended narrative in which Jesus hears that Lazarus is sick, and then he delays going to see him. By the time he gets there, Lazarus has died. There's a long conversation with Mary and Martha and so on. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, this is verse 33, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." Verse 35, Jesus wept. Now just think about that for a second. Jesus displayed, in this case, not the expenditure of capital, but emotional attentiveness and grief to this one particular situation, the death of his friend, in a way that he did not display to other people. How many people died in Judea during Jesus' ministry? Did Jesus go to all of them? Weep for an equal amount of time? Of course he didn't. So there must be something wrong with a pure consequentialist deployment of emotional capital, because Jesus distributes it unevenly. And in fact, it's interesting, even when you start thinking about the deployment of financial capital, you know, the very next chapter in John's Gospel, this is a fascinating example, which is all you need to know that Peter Singer's vision for ethics is at least flawed in some way. In chapter 12 of John's Gospel, we've got the episode where, I'll pick up from verse 3, it's Mary and Martha, and Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table, verse 2. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. So some expensive ointment poured out on Jesus' feet. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was about to betray him, said, consequentialist that he claimed to be, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Can you see the echoes of Singer's rationale? Why would you spend so much money on anointing Jesus' feet, where that's a year's wages or whatever it is? We could have saved lives with this money. Now, it's true, as John goes on to point out, Judas said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief and he used to put his hand into the money bag. And if there are more denarii in the money bag, there's more for him to grab. So Judas was ill-motivated. But Jesus' response was not, that's a really good idea. And we do have some disciples here who I know not to be so ill-motivated. We should have saved this perfume and given it to the poor and made sure the money got to the poor. That's not what Jesus said at all. Jesus said, no, she's done a beautiful thing. Let her alone, that she may keep it for the day of my burial. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. In other words, you can't do deployment of capital in seeking to help the poor or the needy or the vulnerable. And you can't do, the deployment of what we might call emotional attention, including grief, John chapter 11, using a kind of consequentialist equal distribution calculus. So something's wrong with Peter Singer's picture. But still the critique, the problem of working out how do we know what to do lingers in the background. So what I want to do is to sketch for you briefly, if I can, analytically, a picture of a biblical way to analyze ethical decisions, which will reveal the flaws in Peter Singer's vision and also reveal some of the problems that we might slip into in the kind of situation that the lady wrote to me about. And will then, at the end, I'll come back and we'll look at some other possible responses to these tragic floods in Texas, and we'll be in a position then to analyze them and figure out which will be wise and which will be less so. Bear with me a second. Drink of water. Right. So what's a biblical way of analyzing ethical decisions? In biblical terms, every ethical action is an action done by a person in a particular situation. Therefore, the correct way to analyze the action is to focus on all three of those perspectives and give them their appropriate weight in trying to determine whether the action is wise or unwise or good or bad. Those three perspectives have been helpfully named by John Frame, who I think is one of our greatest living theologians and ethicists, and in 200, 300 years' time, he'll be numbered along with John Calvin and Herman Bavinck as one of the most insightful and creative Orthodox Reformed evangelical thinkers of our time. He has helpfully labeled those three perspectives on a moral action, and indeed he's extended this analysis elsewhere to other aspects of theology: normative, existential, and situational. Normative, an action. Existential, done by a person. Situational, in a situation. To put it another way, and I normally highlight the perspectives in a slightly different order, a full analysis and an accurate biblical analysis of any problem in ethics, any question about what we should do, including this question that a lady emailed me about, needs to take account of the normative, situational, and existential perspectives on the action. The normative perspective asks questions about the rules, the norms, the principles that ought to be followed in relation to the particular question. Are there any direct biblical commands? Are there any theological or biblical principles that ought to be followed here? Is there a direct statement in the Bible that tells us what to do, or a direct statement that has a direct implication that tells us what to do? That's the kind of question that the normative perspective calls attention to. The situational perspective calls attention to the consequences of our actions, the circumstances in which they're done, what has led up to this, and what will be downstream from it, what's going to be the result of this. And you recognize, if you just think for a second, you recognize the situational perspective as the kind of framework which is very prominent in the wisdom books like the book of Proverbs, where you have ethical norms that are highlighted particularly with relation to their consequences. Train up a child in the way that he will go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. That's a situationally focused, not exclusively, but situationally focused text of Scripture, because what it does is it calls attention to the consequences of one's actions. There are many, many scriptural texts that highlight this, and though the consequences of actions are not exhaustively able to determine whether something is right or wrong, nonetheless, they're not irrelevant. They're one of the three perspectives that we should bear in mind. And third, existential. The existential perspective asks questions that concern the motives, character, goals, intentions of the person who's doing the action. The existential perspective is highlighted in John 12 by John himself when he remarks, as an aside, he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. So it's a very interesting thought here. Was the suggestion, oh, this could have been sold and given to the poor, was that a sinful or a righteous suggestion? Well, coming from Judas, it was certainly sinful because of its motivation. His intention was, if we can get more money into the money bag, I can take more money out. But it's easy to imagine another disciple, John or Peter or Thaddeus, saying the same thing, but with good intentions and just out of a sense of confusion. Why, Jesus, this is quite a lot of money we just spent on anointing your tootsies. Why did we not give this money to the poor? Because, we know you really love the poor. You care for the poor. You're concerned for the vulnerable. You see, the same action, formal action, in normative terms, so to speak, in the same situation, actually, is differently evaluated in ethical terms because of the existential perspective, which highlights the motives, goals, intentions of the person who's doing the action. So, just to summarize, a full biblical description and evaluation of every action and every decision we've got to take must take account of the normative, situational, and existential perspectives on the action. Now, what's wrong with Peter Singer? Two things. First, he absolutizes just one of those three perspectives. The consequentialist absolutizes the situational perspective and ignores normative concerns and existential concerns. That's the first mistake. The second mistake is that he fails to define his consequentialist perspective in scriptural terms. There's this twofold mistake. Every non-Christian ethical system makes the same two mistakes. First, it absolutizes one of the three biblical Christian perspectives, and then it detaches that perspective from scriptural governance. It is Scripture that ought to tell us what the norms are, Scripture that ought to tell us what consequences matter and what situational factors are relevant, and Scripture ought to tell us what motives and goals and intentions and desires and character traits are laudable and virtuous. It's not self-evident what laudable virtue, laudable motives, laudable character is. It's not self-evident what laudable and good consequences are, and it's not self-evident what good rules and norms and principles are. We need Scripture to define all these things. So when non-Christian ethical systems go wrong, as they do all the time, there are a few fields that are in more of a mess, in my view, than the secular ethical world is a total train wreck. This is the reason why they do. They absolutize one of the three perspectives and they detach it from Scripture. So what Singer has done, very, very sharp guy, very bright man, he's a razor-sharp, hard-edged consequentialist who's letting his own intuitions guide his moral decision-making by letting his own decisions determine what good consequences are. Right. So you've got that picture in your mind, and you might need to roll back 5 minutes and listen to that again. How do we evaluate what's going on with these, with the question that's been asked of me by the lady who emailed me, and actually by the other things that have been going on this week? I heard my lovely wife Nicole said that one of our ladies had, I think, so I'm probably going to get this wrong, so pardon me if it's wrong, but something like she was going to auction off a cake that she'd baked, and you could buy a ticket for $10, and she'd sell gazillion tickets, and one of the tickets would get this amazing cake, and the rest and all the money would go to support relief efforts for the the people in who've been affected by these floods. It's another thing that somebody's, okay, great. How do we deploy these three perspectives and the biblical, ethical, analytical framework that lies behind them to make sense of what's good and what's wise and what's not so good and what's not so wise in these circumstances? Well, let me give you a few ideas. Back to this email, let's start with this question of godly husband saying, let's be careful not to enter into sinful empathy, and thoughtful wife saying, I'm just struggling with this concept. What could be going wrong? Well, it could be the existential perspective on overdrive. Could be that what's happening is that a good response, a biblical response, weep with those who weep, mourn with those who mourn, could become sinful at the point where it causes a person to fail to maintain their commitments, which normative or consequentialist considerations would highlight for them. Let me give you an example. If what you're doing is, you're just grieved in your heart and you're taking a few minutes during your daily times of prayer and Bible reading to pray particularly for the victims of these floods, those affected by them, to pray through a psalm or two, and then getting on with your day, perhaps with a heavy heart, but getting on with your day, all your other responsibilities to your children, your work, the home, everything else. God bless you, God be praised. But you can easily imagine somebody, and I don't think this is the lady here by any means, but you could easily imagine a situation where somebody is so grief-stricken that they're so overwhelmed that they are basically just sitting in their chair all day, just weeping in sorrow about this situation and failing to take seriously those other responsibilities, failing to look after their kids, failing to discharge their responsibilities to their husband or their wife or around the home or whatever else. You see what's happened there is the existential perspective, I'm mourning with those who mourn, has overwhelmed other relevant biblical criteria. For example, work hard with your hands so that you won't be dependent on anybody, normative. Work hard with your hands so that you won't be dependent on anybody, situational, because consequential, right? You have children to feed. We have work to do. We have other obligations to undertake. And it would be a mistake to allow our feelings to be so determinative that they cause us to neglect other Christian biblical obligations. That would be to make one of the mistakes. It's not that the existential perspective is detached from biblical norms, but it is that the existential perspective is isolated and prioritized in a way that is not appropriate. That's one way we could do it. Related to that, and this is part of the same thing, of course, is just for our feelings to drive us. And I think this is what the husband in question is talking about. The sinful empathy is the act of feeling a moral obligation to act out of simply sharing this other person's feelings. They're grieving, I'm grieving. Well, that's not helping. If I'm grieving, I do need some people around me to grieve with me. Grieve with those who grieve, mourn with those who mourn. People close to me, people in my family, people in my church, people in my local community. It doesn't help me much if people all over the world are grieving in a way that causes them to renege on other commitments and responsibilities they have. It does help me if they're praying. Yeah, that helps. And praying from the heart and praying with compassion. And in that sense, sharing my grief. But it's in the limit, in the worst case, empathy can become a kind of self-serving emotion, because especially in a kind of an environment influenced strongly by critical social justice ideology, it can become validating. So just roughly speaking, briefly, critical social justice ideology teaches us seeks to teach people to find some locus of life in which they are a victim, and our moral standing increases in proportion to our sense of victimhood. And so people seek within that framework to identify all kinds of different ways in which they are victims of others or oppressed by others. And the more overlapping, intersectional is the technical word, domains in which they can identify their victims or their suffering in some way, the greater their standing in the community is, the more moral worth they have. Now you can see how that kind of thinking absolutely parasitizes empathy. And we can be affected by it. The critical social justice ideology is still the air we breathe, even in 2025, post-Trump 2.0. CSJ is not dead and won't be dead for a while. And so we should be aware of that. And anybody, and perhaps particularly those who know themselves to be more emotional, people are different, aren't they? If you know yourself to be more emotional, do take care, please, that the sense of feeling what somebody else feels is not becoming a kind of source of significance for you or meaning for you. Okay, so that's one possible response, just trying to put some of this ethical framework around that. Let's look at some other things that you might do. I mentioned sending financial support or running a fundraiser to raise financial support. I actually think those are great ideas. I mean, obviously, if you have a job and other responsibilities, which we all should have, then there's an appropriate balance to be drawn between how much time and therefore how much money we devote to this one particular cause over other responsibilities. And this is the point where the shallow pond versus 10,000 children in sub-Saharan Africa becomes prominent. In the light of Jesus' response to Lazarus, I think it is appropriate and reasonable to say people who are closer to us, physically closer to us, in our town, in our neighborhood, in our family, in our church, or in our state, it is right that tragedies affecting those people should occupy a more salient place in our consciousness than tragedies affecting people we don't know. But we have to keep some kind of scale of values. I'll give you an example. I was talking about this with my wife. We're sitting outside on Tuesday evening, and I said, well, look, if we heard a loud scream from one of our neighbours' properties, we would go around or hop over the fence and try and see what's happening. And maybe somebody's alone in the house and has spilled a pan of boiling water over themselves or something. We feel, rightly we feel, a greater degree of responsibility to try to help those who are even just physically closer to us, because we're embodied creatures. There's a theology of the body under the surface here where we can only really help in really meaningful ways those who are very close to us. This is why, by the way, it's a very good thing for parents, for people to adopt children. You're helping one child at the cost of countless tens of thousands of dollars and immense amount of time, where the rational deployment consequentialist like Peter Singer would say, no, that's immoral because you should be deploying that time and capital to help more people. I'd say, no, it's not, because actually we should take more serious account of those who are close to us, and you can't get much closer to them within your family. And actually, existentially that impacts you as a person, and even consequentially down the road, it has the potential to impact future generations. And normatively, for a family to show compassion like that is clearly a biblical idea. So adoption is such a central theme in biblical theology that for us to mirror God's adoption of us by adopting children is a truly wonderful thing to do, notwithstanding the fact that in raw calculus-based consequentialist terms, it's kind of expensive. All right, so where were we? Yeah, sending money to people who are particularly close to us is great. I think we've just got to seek wisdom in trying to make sense of how those responsibilities measure up against other responsibilities we should have to our daily vocations and our families, and some sense of proportion with tragedies nearby and tragedies that are far away. There's one other example I came across. What could we do to help? We have a CREC church, a church in our denomination, that is only about 10 minutes away, or at least the pastor only lives about 10 minutes away from the Guadalupe River, flows 10 minutes away from their house. And so for them and their church, one of the questions that arose in the last few days was, well, maybe we should go and help. Now, again, there's a response that is highly intuitively appealing, particularly to, a guy with a truck, a chainsaw, and a free weekend. Well, head on down. You know what I mean? It's like, why would you not do that? Well, it turns out there's a very good reason why you might not do that, because in consequentialist terms, it might not be as helpful as you think it would be. I think what's happening in some of those circumstances, I mean, the people in the church were moved to help. These people are nearby. They're nearby to us. Maybe we could just go and help the rescue efforts, help search for survivors, help people to clear the debris from their homes, and so on and so forth. But when they tried to do that, they were told, and they discovered firsthand, that there are so many people coming to help that they're clogging up the roads and making it difficult for any help to get through. My impression is that this is not a situation where you've got an inefficient disaster response from the government being, and people who could actually do good being turned away. You've got a broader based response, but there's such a thing as too many people, right? And for this congregation, 10 or 15 minutes away from one of the sites of this disaster, they decided not to go physically to help because, and I'll frame it in the kind of analytical terms we've been using, in consequentialist terms, it would have been destructive and unhelpful. Existentially, it feels like the right thing to do. I've got Friday off and I can take all day Saturday, jump in my truck, and head down and see who I can help. Yeah, totally understandable. But I'm not sure that good intentions always lead to good outcomes. It's possible to be well-intentioned and to do foolish things. I mean, there are so many chunks of debris floating down the river that some of the bridges that look safe turn out not to be safe. And so you're not helping others by putting yourself at risk of joining those who are in a car floating downstream in a flooded river, right? So, okay. So where have we got to? We began with how we respond to these kinds of tragedies and some basic, intuitively common sense Christian responses. And then what we noticed is that those responses generate questions about how we respond in other situations, which some of our non-Christian friends in the ethical and philosophical worlds have sought answer, not always very helpfully, but raising questions that need a good Christian analysis. And I hope that what I've said has at least sketched the contents page for what that theological analysis might look like. The final thing I want to say is just a more general point, to restate something I've said before. Our feelings are really, really important. And therefore it's important that they be cultivated and directed by and with wisdom. Feelings as such are a terrible guide to moral decision making. They are a terrible guide to wise choices. Instead, what's needed is not more feelings or more empathy, but more, let's call it rational compassion, with a footnote to Paul Bloom, where the rational and the compassion are defined in biblical terms. Because then what we'll find is that we're keeping the normative precepts of Scripture. We are actually helping in the situation. And in so doing, we are becoming more virtuous people. Normative, situational, existential. Thank you to this lady for a very thoughtful email. Thank you to you for enduring to the end. You've been listening to the All Saints podcast. God bless.